So before I explain why Cathie Woods' predictions are wrong and wildly bearish, let's break down her maths. So Cathie has these three scenarios for Bitcoin: this bearish, her base case, and a bullish case for Bitcoin. And we can see, let's start breaking each one of these down. So her bearish case for Bitcoin by 2030 is that it hits $258,000. And we can see that in her estimates, if Bitcoin is to reach this $258,000 figure, she estimates that Bitcoin would have to take around 20% of gold's market cap. So it would become this digital store of value. So today gold is a $12 trillion asset, and Cathie's saying Bitcoin can grab about 20% of that market cap. And I don't think Cathie's estimate actually assumes that Bitcoin directly takes that 20% market share from gold. This could assume that gold's market cap also rises, and Bitcoin does get some of this new capital looking for a store of value in the digital realm. So Cathie is just simply saying, look, Bitcoin can attract somewhere around $3 trillion of capital in the next 7 years of people simply looking for a digital store of value, okay? So this $4 trillion of capital inflows represents that big purple block on Cathie's estimate of Bitcoin reaching 258,000, and the other little slither of green on that little bearish case for Bitcoin that Cathie's put out there, that is actually made up by the global remittance market. So from the column over here, Cathie says that in a bearish scenario for Bitcoin in the next 7 years, Bitcoin could actually capture 5% of the global remittance market. So for those who don't know what that is, let's break down what it is. Every single year, there's around $830 billion that is sent across borders all around the world. So a very common example of a remittance market is El Salvador, okay? El Salvador has some of the higher remittance numbers on a percent capita basis out of most countries around the world. That is one of the reasons why Bukele adopted Bitcoin for the country of El Salvador, because it helps reduce fees for these cross-border remittance transactions, okay? So for many of these countries that have very high remittance numbers, this is happening because many of the young people are actually leaving this country, going to try to earn a wage that is much higher in another country. And what happens is these people will actually send value back home to their family. This is what a remittance is. And we can see that all around the world, there's around $830 billion in remittances in 2022 alone. And let's take a look at the countries, because I think this is really interesting. Some of the countries here with the highest volumes of remittances are actually coincidentally some of the countries with the highest amount of Bitcoin adoption. So we can see here, India, the Philippines, Egypt, Pakistan, Nigeria. These are all countries who do have surging Bitcoin adoption. And Cathie is just saying, look, Bitcoin could potentially grab 5% of this market share moving forward into the future by 2030, okay? So these aren't outrageous predictions, or these aren't outrageous dominations of Bitcoin. She's just saying, look, these are just two markets where Bitcoin could grab a little bit of market share. And I even think some of the most bearish people on Bitcoin would even have to admit, look, maybe Bitcoin can achieve these figures, okay? Even in 1 or 2 years in El Salvador, where Bitcoin's been legal tender, we've seen Bitcoin grab around 3 to 4% of the remittance volume in that country. So to project that Bitcoin could grab 5% of the global remittances over the next 7 years, I don't think it's a big leap, okay? So that's the bearish case for Bitcoin. We can see that in this scenario, Cathie Woods believes that Bitcoin is not going to be adopted by any corporate treasuries. It's not going to be adopted by any nation states. And she says that all of the institutional capital in the world, they're probably only going to put 1% of their money into Bitcoin. Okay, so this is very bearish, very conservative, because we know that we have already seen corporations around the world begin to adopt Bitcoin. Corporations like MicroStrategy have over $4 billion worth of Bitcoin. Cathie's saying, look, MicroStrategy was the exemption. I don't think any of this is going to happen in the next 7 years. This is in her bearish case, her bearish outcome and bearish outlook. So I think that's very conservative, because we have seen lots of private companies actually begin to put Bitcoin on its balance sheet, okay? So she's saying none of that's going to happen, and she's also saying no nation states are going to adopt Bitcoin. So she's saying no countries like El Salvador are going to do what they did, okay? She's going to say, look, ignore that. Which is interesting, because El Salvador's already put a lot of Bitcoin on its balance sheet. We even more recently saw a country like Oman say they're going to invest $1 billion into actually mining Bitcoin in their country. And we also recently, earlier in the year, saw that the Kingdom of Bhutan actually got exposed for mining Bitcoin since 2019. And they came out and said, look, we're going to invest another $500 million into expanding our mining operation that we kept secret for the past 3 years. So I think it's very bearish, very conservative to say no nation states are going to begin to accumulate Bitcoin over the next 7 years, considering all the action we've seen in the past 2 years alone. So that's the bearish case for Bitcoin. Now let's look at Cathie Woods' base case. So this is what she expects to happen. She expects to see a $682,800 Bitcoin price by 2030. Now let's look at the differences of her expectations of a base case versus her bearish case. So in this scenario, she actually believes that Bitcoin could grab 10% of the global remittance market. That $800 billion market, she believes Bitcoin can grab $80 billion capital from it. Very interesting. I think that's, again, very conservative. I'm going to tell you why I believe it's wrong later on. But you can see here the other big difference in her base case for Bitcoin. She believes Bitcoin can actually grab 40% of the current gold market as it becoming a digital store of value. The other big difference in this base case is Cathie actually believes that Bitcoin could grab 40% of the digital TAM for a store of value, or digital gold, quote unquote. So this would actually represent $4.8 trillion of demand for Bitcoin. So again, I think it's conservative, but those are the two big differences in Cathie Woods' base case. She also assumes that Bitcoin could actually find itself within 2.5% of all corporate treasuries. She also believes it could find itself into 1% of the global nation-state treasuries. And she also believes it can grab some small market shares from many other economic buckets around the world. She also believes it can grab 3% of the emerging market currencies. Again, this is very bearish, okay? This is her base case. But let's remember, just recently, Bitcoin became the 16th largest currency in the entire world, okay? There's 160 currencies out there. Bitcoin is number 16 already, and the white paper only turned 15 years old just last month, okay? I think in the next 7 years, Bitcoin can do a whole lot of damage, and I would not be surprised to see it being one of the largest currencies in the world. So it's going to be much bigger than all of these small emerging market currencies that Cathie Wood is saying Bitcoin can grab 3% of. But anyway, that's her projections, that's her numbers. She also believes that it can become a settlement network and grab 5% of that. And you guys can see the other buckets on the screen that Cathie Wood believes Bitcoin can grab a small percentage share in the next 7 years. I'm very interested to see that she believes that Bitcoin can actually grab 6.5% of all the institutional capital around the world that is managed by these large institutions. That's a pretty big share. I'm not going to lie. That's a good chunk, 6.5%. And I'm also very interested to see that the amount of share she believes it can take from the remittance volume. Cathie believes that Bitcoin can grab 25% market share of that $800 billion market. And you can see in this bullish case, Cathie is assuming Bitcoin's going to grab a little bit more market share of each of these other asset classes around the world. And we can see, let's actually have a look at the CAGRs, or the compound annual growth rates, of each one of these projections. So in the bullish estimate for Bitcoin, where she believes Bitcoin could hit $1.48 million, this would actually assume that Bitcoin grows from today, 2023, to 2030 by 75% per year. And for her base case, she's assuming Bitcoin could grow at 60% every single year on average. And her bearish case, she's assuming Bitcoin could grow by 40% every single year. Now, let me tell you why that's wildly bearish. So Bitcoin's CAGR, its compound annual growth rate, is over 100%, but it does depend on what time frame you are looking at. Now, that 100% figure is much bigger than Cathie Wood's bullish case and bullish estimate of 75%. And it is also looking at possibly the worst 10-year time frame you could be looking at Bitcoin from. Why do I say that? Well, 2023, we're at the very bottom of a bear market, okay? Bitcoin has been declining for the past 2 years. And when does that 10-year window begin? It begins in 2013. That's just after Bitcoin went on that huge double bull market back in 2012 and 2013. That's when it begins measuring price. That was when Bitcoin was beginning its bear market back in 2013, 2014, 2015. So again, 100% returns in what I think is possibly the worst window to be looking at Bitcoin over a 10-year time frame. So if you're looking back historically, whether you look at the really bullish 196% or the even more bearish 100% CAGR, Cathie Woods' bullish CAGR of 75% is pretty low. It's pretty conservative. And I think it's very, very conservative when you consider this one thing about Bitcoin. This is where I think she's wrong about everything. So now this gets me into the crux of the video. My core concern with not only Cathie Woods' bearish forecasts and predictions, but most people who talk about these diminishing returns of Bitcoin and all of these cute 4-year models, most people think that they can just predict what Bitcoin is going to do in the next 15 years based upon what it's done in its first 15 years. But I think all of that is wrong because Bitcoin is a technology. We know that technologies do not get adopted in this linear, extrapolatable, predictable fashion. Technologies never get adopted like this. They get adopted very slowly and very gradually in the beginning of its adoption cycle. Then an inflection point is reached and that adoption goes absolutely exponential. And look, I don't know where Bitcoin adoption is today. Nobody does, okay? There's lots of good estimates. Some people say it's around 1%, around 2% adoption, but I just don't think we're going to see the same level of adoption that we have seen in the past 15 years extrapolated forwards into the future. I think an inflection point was reached in 2020, and I think most people aren't prepared for the new regime that we have entered in Bitcoin's life. Before 2020, there were no nation states buying Bitcoin like El Salvador. There were no guerrilla Bitcoin mining operations like what we saw in Bhutan and Oman and all of these other countries mining Bitcoin. We didn't see any of that publicly before 2020. We also didn't see any corporations like Michael Saylor buy $4.5 billion of Bitcoin like he is doing with his public company. We saw none of that before 2020. All we saw was retail speculators buy Bitcoin, and we saw the number of Bitcoin available for sale for these speculators to play with only increase as the exchange balance of Bitcoin only grew. But since 2020, we've seen all of these new entrants enter the Bitcoin market, and we've also seen something different. We've seen the number of Bitcoin on exchanges decline and go down for the first time in Bitcoin's life. So I think the fact that 1% of the world has adopted Bitcoin and it's gone from $0 to $35,000, I think most people aren't prepared for what would hypothetically happen if Bitcoin is adopted like a technology and all of a sudden we do see the other 80 to 90% of the world all rush to adopt Bitcoin in a pretty short time window, like a 5 or 10 year period. This is what normally happens with technologies. Not saying Bitcoin's going to be adopted exactly like every other technology that has been adopted, but I think we should be prepared for that situation. And I don't know how that is going to go, considering we are seeing a declining amount of supply of Bitcoin on exchanges. Today, there's only around 2.5 million coins on exchanges available for sale. And then we haven't even begun talking about how the Bitcoin multiplier effect could really start playing around with Bitcoin's price and send it exponential if we do see an exponential period of adoption in Bitcoin's life. If you want to learn a little bit more about Bitcoin's adoption S-curve and how the Bitcoin multiplier effect could play into it, gonna recommend you check out a video that we recorded on that topic. I'll pop a link that's going to take you straight to it on screen right there. And with all that said, let me know in the comments down below whether you think Cathie Woods' $1.48 million Bitcoin price prediction is bearish, conservative, bullish. I want to hear your thoughts. Leave them in the comments down below, and I'll see you all in the next video.